Well, first of all, the greatest generation applies to World War II. You know, I obviously a generation that saw the trials and tribulations and the hardship of the country's greatest economic downturn, only to be called into action to not just save what some would believe the United States, but at least Western civilization. The greatest generation is a generation that answered the bell. They answered the call.
There basically were three forces that affected the Great Generation, and it was the Depression was the first force, and then followed by the World War II, the second force, and then the rebuilding and restoring changing from a wartime economic system to a economic-based economy. The thing that makes the difference about these three forces on people and that makes the Great Generation is what decisions they made about that. It was what they decided to do, and had their decisions been different, they might not have become the Great Generation.
This country has seen trials and tribulations in its first 150 years, from the American Revolution to, of course, the Civil War, the last being World War II. I don't see in our lifetime, maybe in my child's lifetime, a war the scale of World War II.
I would describe a person who was a Great Generation member as my mother, who joined many women in our town, like they did all over the United States, in putting packages together to send to the troops and doing all sorts of things to include the war effort. And I would include my dad, who went to Houston to build ships that were used in the war. I would include my uncle, who fought in the Great North African Campaign and went with Patton up through the boot of Italy. Those were people of the Great Generation. I would include Charles Clyburn, who worked here at East Central for years, who was a B-17 pilot, shot out of a plane, completely destroyed the plane, flew another plane, and became a great pilot and a hero. There were other people involved here from Ada that fought in the war, and Paul Alford was one of those people. Those were part of the Great Generation. And those people who actually faced battle, who went up in bombers and fighter planes, and who crawled on the ground with rifles and grenades, those were the greatest of the Great Generation. One of the people that exhibits that is our speaker for this series, R.V. Bergen. People who saw the first-hand death of other people. Those were the Great Generation.
You know, there's a number of answers to the question about the origins of the Great Depression. It's ordinarily understood as a kind of a collapse of the speculative economy that had grown up around the stock market and so forth, and that's certainly a factor in it. However, there were some structural weaknesses in the overall economy that were reflected in the Great Depression, and one of the most important ones was the agricultural economy. The beginnings of the agricultural depression actually goes back to overexpansion in conjunction with the First World War, which inflated the demand for varied agricultural products. In the case of East Texas, and most likely Mr. Bergen's farming experience, that affected the cotton economy. And so you had a high of cotton prices right around the First World War that began dropping gradually through the 1920s. But up until about 1926, it was still possible for a person to thrive as relatively well off, even as a sharecropper in the cotton economy. Cotton was the primary cash crop for farmers of that period of time, and with the precipitous decline in prices, then there simply, there was no cash available to anybody. The sharecroppers who had traditionally moved from one farm to the next were literally forced off the land because there was just no way that they could make a living. And in many places they were supplanted by the potential that tractors offered for a farmer to consolidate his land and to hire one sharecropper to farm let's say 160 acres, whereas he had previously had 4 sharecroppers on that. So there was a lot of people just forced off the land to the cities, to what were called Hoovervilles. They were living along rivers in the very urban areas and so forth, in paper shacks, just literally trying to scrape by. And then, of course, a lot of them migrated. This was the period, by the time we get into the late 1920s and early 1930s, this is the period of the Great Migration to California, which we think of as the Dust Bowl migration, but it's really spawned by the collapse of the cotton economy. And that spawns the movement of the Jodes that's depicted in John Steinbeck's novel of Okie migration. But that migration was also a lot of people out of anywhere that had the possibility of getting to California would try and make it, and a lot of them out of Texas and Arkansas and similar cotton producing areas. The result of all this was essentially the emergence of a barter economy. There was an awful lot of, people would go all year long on a dollar, but they were trading labor, they were trading a pig for the shoes that they needed or whatever else it was, and so there was a tremendous amount of bartering. But ultimately what represented salvation for the farmers as well as the overall economy was the coming of the New Deal, which takes place with Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932. And that gave subsidies for agricultural prices as well as creating work opportunities for people. So, in the terms of the overall Great Depression, just to give you an idea of the scope of it, 1 person in 3 was out of work. Another third was underemployed. And they had no unemployment benefits. Most of them were single-family earners and so forth. I mean, it was really hard times. The level of hardship that generation encountered with the Depression, in many respects, the Depression drove the rural economy back to pioneer-level conditions. But then the greatest generation struggled through the Depression and then fought the Second World War. But I think that the Depression destroyed an element of hope among a lot of people. And some people, just gave up and died. But those who managed to hold on in that period of time actually saw the war as an opportunity for the restoration of hope and of doing something to achieve an enduring hope, if you will.
World War II for most people is a war in which was fought in Europe. Unfortunately, the Pacific gets short shaft, and there's a historical reason for that. Primarily because the powers to be in Washington decided Europe to be the main theater of operation. Hitler was more dangerous to not just Europe, but to our strategic interests. Nevertheless, unlike in Europe, the Pacific theater was primarily an American operation. Yes, we had Australian, New Zealand, and British help. Yes, we had Chinese. Yes, we had Filipino help. But unlike in Europe, the United States did the overwhelming amount of fighting in the Pacific. The Southwest Pacific Campaign is going to be one of the longest of the war. In some elements, it will last the entire war, from 1943 all the way to 1945. It'll be marked by certain characteristics. First and foremost, the tenacity of the Japanese fighter. Second of all, we're talking about the Southwest Pacific. It's going to be hot or it's going to be hotter. More importantly, you're going to have rain, and more rain. You're going to have lots of malarial swamps, lots of mosquitoes. You're never going to feel comfortable because this is an area that has very little in what most Americans would call civilization, made up of villages and the like. Following Guadalcanal, which was the first and major operation against the Japanese on land, the United States and its allies will then begin hopping from island to island in the Southwest Pacific. The overall goal was to attack at the base of Rabaul. Rabaul is on New Britain. New Britain is a large island that before the war was under a British protectorate. we are going to have several operations to attack New Britain, the first being Cape Gloucester. Cape Gloucester was by World War II standards, a fairly small operation, mainly because the objective was one island and specifically one air base. Following Cape Gloucester, the Americans will then begin moving in a northwestward operation toward the Japanese main islands. Now, what was discovered and seen at Cape Gloucester will be not unique to Cape Gloucester. Cape Gloucester will be rain, will be a Japanese defense which is going to improve as they fight the Americans, and also a Japanese defender who is going to fight to the very end. The Cape Gloucester operation that is most important will only last a couple of months. And the reason being is, once the airfield is established, once the harbors are taken, the rest of the Japanese garrison will effectively be left to rot on the vine. And that's exactly what happens. Cape Gloucester is one operation of which takes a small portion of the island, but it doesn't take the whole island. In fact, the main Japanese at Rabaul will remain there until August and September of 1945. But once the Americans have what they want on New Britain, which is where Cape Gloucester is, they will then begin moving, bunny hopping around the Solomons as well as the New Britain island chains. Now, following that, you will see a debate of whether we should go to certain places. Both the Navy and the Army will debate, do we need to take this island or do we not need to take this island? Now, some of this strategic debate is simply the Navy doesn't want to do it to help the Army, or the Army doesn't want to do it to help the Navy. But at a further level, some people truly want to ask, do we need to take this? Is it that important to put American lives? And you see that with the Palau operation, which will be the Battle of Peleliu. Now, the Battle of Peleliu will be one of the fiercest of the Pacific War. Right up there with Iwo Jima, right up there with Okinawa. And the reason being is, by the time the Americans will attack Peleliu in late 44, a battle that was predicted to only take approximately a couple of days will actually take well over 2.5 months. Now, in part, you could say the Americans weren't ready to fight the way that their commander is predicting. And because previous operations with some of the Japanese on some of the islands, the minute the Americans got ashore, the Japanese resistance went like that, with banzai charges and the like. But once the Americans started moving inward through a series of intricate fortifications and defensive works, the Japanese would make the American forces pay every yard, every foot, very bloodily. Because of Peleliu's terrain, it is not a flat, featureless sandbar type of island that you see in the South Pacific or Central Pacific. Peleliu is an island that is honeycombed by one large mountain, as well as a steeped raise at the beaches. The Japanese will use this superior ground much to their benefit. Now, Peleliu will unfortunately go down in history as one of the most criticized battles of the Pacific War. Following Peleliu, both the Southwest Pacific and the Central Pacific will start to converge. And they will converge as they get closer to the Japanese islands. First with Iwo Jima, and then of course secondly with Okinawa. Okinawa will be one of, if not the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. I'm excluding, of course, China. There are approximately 100,000 Japanese defenders on Okinawa. Unfortunately, they're going to fight to basically the last man, much as they did on Iwo Jima, much as they did in other places. And after nearly 3 months of fighting, the Americans will have over approximately 50,000 casualties. Now, Okinawa will prove very important for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese islands. Unfortunately for the Japanese, their days are numbered, because shortly after the Battle of Okinawa, 2 bombs were dropped, which thus ended the war. Thankfully for the Marines and soldiers that would no longer have to invade the island itself. As you move closer and closer to Japan, the defensive operations of the Japanese soon become perfected. And unfortunately, tens of thousands of Americans have to find this out with their blood. And you see that at places like Peleliu, and you see that at places like Okinawa, which were much differently defended than places like Guadalcanal and even a place like Tarawa. The United States has fought many wars. None has had the universal and consensus applaud of the American people, both to fight it and then, of course, to welcome the veterans home than World War II. From the Revolutionary War to the current war on terror, we have never had the consensus, that is, everybody on one page, that we had in World War II. We didn't have it, obviously, in Vietnam. We didn't even have it in Korea. We didn't have it in the Civil War. We didn't have it in the War of 1812. We didn't have it in any wars we fought except World War II. There was no criticism of whether we should fight it once we're in it, and there was no criticism about how it handed out. More importantly, because of the monumental task of World War II, and then seeing the belligerents, particularly the enemies, and almost the maniacal evil that both Imperial Japan and, of course, Nazi Germany represented, it would not be a stretch to say that the soldiers who fought World War II were not just on the side of good, but they saved effectively civilization and mankind. Because I don't want to know what the world would be under a Nazi-held Europe or an Imperial Japan Asia. What they came home to was something that few soldiers, with the exception of recent times, know what it's like. Basically a grateful, not just country, but world.
Americans became highly disciplined with a great work ethic, and there was a dramatic sense of community that developed during the war. People were a part of that community war effort. There was a resolve, a great resolve. The Japanese leader who bombed Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, after they had bombed Pearl Harbor and they're headed back to Japan, his crew was jubilant. All of the pilots were just ecstatic because they saw what damage they'd done. And Yamamoto, that's been marked down in history as a great quote, said, "I'm afraid all we have done is awakened a great giant and filled him with an awesome resolve."